The town of Redemption Bend burned like a paper lantern caught in a windstorm. Jacob Mercer saw the orange glow from 3 miles out, cresting the ridge just as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks. His horse, a gray mare named Ash, sensed his tension and quickened her pace without prompting. The smell reached him first, not just wood smoke, but something chemical, something wrong. Kerosene. Deliberate fire. He had been riding for 6 days straight, tracking the men who had murdered his brother. 6 days of cold camps and hard ground, following a trail that grew fresher with each passing hour. 6 days of imagining what he would do when he finally caught them, how he would make them answer for Thomas's blood spilled on the floor of a saloon in Silver Creek. But none of that mattered now. The trail had led him here, to this burning town, and something in his chest tightened like a fist around his heart. Redemption Bend was not a large settlement. Maybe 200 souls on a good day, most of them miners and their families, a few ranchers, fewer merchants. The kind of place that appeared on no official maps, that existed only because men had found silver in the hills and needed somewhere to drink and sleep and pretend they were building something lasting. Jacob had passed through once, 3 years prior, and remembered little except a church with a crook steeple and a woman serving pie at the boarding house. Now that church was an inferno. The steeple had already collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the darkening sky like dying stars. The boarding house was next to go, flames licking up its western wall, consuming the weathered clapboard with hungry efficiency. The general store, the assayer's office, the saloon, all burning, all beyond saving. Jacob drove Ash down the slope at a reckless gallop, dirt spraying beneath her hooves. The mare's ears pressed flat against her skull, but she did not balk. She had carried him through worse. Through gunfights and stampedes, through floods and blizzards. She would carry him through this. The main street was chaos incarnate. Men ran with buckets that seemed pathetically inadequate against the towering flames. Women clutched children and bundles of possessions, their faces smeared with soot and tears. An old man sat in the middle of the road, staring at nothing, his hands hanging limp at his sides. A dog barked frantically, running in circles, searching for an owner who might already be Ash. Jacob dismounted before Ash had fully stopped, his boots hitting packed earth hard enough to jar his knees. He scanned the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had seen violence before, who knew how to parse chaos into discrete problems. The bucket brigade was pointless, the fires were too far advanced. The people needed to move away from the structures before they collapsed. The horses in the livery stable needed to be freed before they burned alive. He moved toward the stable first, shielding his face against the heat. The building was not yet fully engulfed, but smoke poured from its interior in thick, choking clouds. He could hear the animals inside, their screams almost human in their terror. The main door was already open, hanging askew on broken hinges, and several horses had fled into the night. But others remained, too frightened to navigate the smoke, trapped in their stalls by their own panic. Jacob pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth and plunged inside. The world became heat and blindness. Smoke seared his lungs despite the cloth. His eyes watered instantly, reducing his vision to blurred shapes and the orange pulse of flame somewhere to his left. A beam groaned overhead, wood splitting with a sound like a gunshot. He moved by instinct, hands outstretched, finding the first stall by touch alone. The horse inside reared as he approached, hooves flashing. He caught the animal's halter, held firm despite the thrashing, and pulled it toward where he remembered the door being. The horse fought him, wild with fear, but he was stronger. He always had been. Too strong, his mother used to say. Born with hands that could break things without meaning to. He shoved the horse toward the exit and felt it bolt past him into fresher air. 1 saved. He counted 6 stalls. 5 more to go. The second horse came easier, following him almost gratefully. The third was already down, overcome by smoke, and he could not lift it. He tried, muscles straining, but the animal was dead weight. He left it, hating himself, and moved to the fourth stall. Empty. The fifth stall held a mule that bit his shoulder before he could get the gate open. He ignored the pain, ignored the warmth of blood seeping into his shirt, and dragged the animal out. The sixth stall was at the far end, near where the fire burned hottest. The smoke was so thick now that he moved on hands and knees, the floor slightly cooler, slightly clearer. His lungs felt raw, each breath a knife blade. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, edges going dark. The sixth stall was not empty. She was curled in the corner, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around her head. At first, he thought she was dead. But then she coughed a wet, terrible sound and tried to shrink further into the corner, away from him, away from everything. Jacob did not hesitate. He could not. The building was coming down, seconds away from collapse. He reached for her, and she struck at him weakly, blindly. He caught her wrists, pinned them, and hauled her into his arms. She was light, terrifyingly so, all sharp angles and fragile bones. She struggled against him, but she had no strength left. The smoke had taken it. He ran. The world exploded behind him. A support beam gave way with a sound like thunder, and half the roof came down in a cascade of fire and sparks and splintered wood. Heat washed over his back, singeing the hair on his neck, but he did not stop. He burst through the stable doors and kept running, putting distance between them and the dying building, until his legs finally gave out and he collapsed onto the street, the woman still clutched against his chest. They lay there together, both coughing, both gasping for air that tasted of ash, but was nonetheless sweet. He could feel her heart hammering against his ribs, a desperate rhythm that seemed too fast to sustain. Her hands, which had been pushing against him, now gripped his shirt, holding on as if he were the only solid thing left in a world gone liquid with flame. Behind them, the stable collapsed entirely, becoming a mountain of fire that sent a column of sparks spiraling into the night sky. Jacob watched it burn, watched the embers rift and dance, and thought about how fragile everything was. How quickly it all turned to ash. The woman in his arms was still trembling. He looked down at her for the first time, really looked, and felt something shift in his chest. She was younger than he had expected, maybe 25, with dark hair matted with soot and sweat. Her face was smudged, her dress torn and scorched, but even through the grime, he could see she was beautiful. The kind of beauty that felt dangerous, that made men do stupid things. Her eyes opened. They were gray, the color of storm clouds, and filled with a terror so raw it made him want to look away, but he did not. He held her gaze, tried to communicate through it that she was safe now, that the worst was over. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but only a rasping sound came out, her voice destroyed by smoke. She tried again, more desperately, her fingers digging into his shirt. She was trying to tell him something urgent, something that could not wait. He leaned closer, put his ear near her lips. She whispered 3 words, barely audible, each one costing her. And everything changed. The words she whispered were these: "I said it." Jacob froze. Around them, the town continued to burn. People continued to scream, but all of it seemed suddenly distant, muted, as if you were hearing it through water. He pulled back, looked at her face, searching for signs that he had misheard. But her eyes told him everything. Guilt, shame, a desperation that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with what she had done. He released her, perhaps more roughly than he intended, and scrambled backward. She collapsed onto the street, too weak to support herself, but he barely noticed. His mind was reeling, trying to reconcile what he had just heard with the woman he had just saved. He had risked his life for her, had nearly died in that stable, and she had caused this. All of this. She was weeping now, silent tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. Her lips moved, forming words he could not hear, explanations he was not sure he wanted to understand. Behind her, a house collapsed in on itself with a groan like a dying animal. A woman's scream cut through the night, shrill and broken. A child somewhere called for his mother. Jacob stood. His legs were unsteady, his lungs still burning, but he forced himself upright. He needed to move away from her, needed to think, needed to decide what to do with this knowledge. The logical part of his mind, the part shaped by law and order, and the belief that actions had consequences, told him he should turn her over to whatever authority still existed in this burning town. She had confessed. She was guilty. Justice was simple. But nothing felt simple. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not a monster but something broken. Something already punished. Her hands were blistered, her dress singed in a dozen places. She had been in that stable, in the fire, when he found her. She had not tried to escape. She had curled into a corner and waited to die. He ran a hand through his hair, fingers trembling with adrenaline and shock. Around them, the flames continued their work. The entire eastern side of town was gone now, reduced to smoldering wreckage. The western side would not last much longer. People were fleeing into the surrounding hills, carrying what they could, leaving behind everything else. A lifetime of work, of dreams, turning to ash before their eyes. Because of her. Jacob turned away, unable to look at her anymore. His mare Ash was nearby, watching him with liquid brown eyes that seemed to hold judgment. He walked to her, pressed his forehead against her neck, and tried to breathe through the rage building in his chest. His brother was dead, murdered, and he had abandoned that trail to save someone who had done exactly what he had been hunting men for doing, destroying lives, taking what was not theirs to take. A hand touched his arm, so lightly he almost did not feel it. He spun, and she was there, somehow on her feet despite everything. Up close he could see her face more clearly. She was probably beautiful once, before the smoke and soot, before whatever had driven her to this madness. Her eyes were red-rimmed and desperate, fixed on his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She tried to speak again, her damaged voice producing only harsh whispers, but he caught fragments. Had to, no choice. They would have. He shook his head, cutting her off. Whatever her reasons, they did not matter, could not matter. You did not burn down a town. You did not destroy the lives of innocents. There was no justification large enough to contain this. But even as he thought it, doubt crept in. He had done terrible things in his life. Had killed men, some who probably did not deserve it. Had made choices that haunted him in the small hours of the morning. Who was he to judge? A man stumbled past them, cradling his burned hands against his chest, sobbing. Jacob grabbed him, made him stop, asked if there was a doctor, a lawman, anyone in charge. The man just stared at him with blank, shocked eyes, then pulled free and continued walking into the darkness. Gone. Everyone was gone. The town was dying, and its people were scattering like seeds on the wind. The woman tugged at his sleeve again. She was pointing toward the northern edge of town, where the buildings were fewer, where the fire had not yet spread. Jacob followed her gesture and saw it a small structure, partially hidden by a stand of cottonwoods. A cabin, isolated from the others, untouched by flame. She was pointing at it insistently, still trying to speak, her broken voice forming shapes he could not decipher. He made a decision. Perhaps it was the wrong one. Perhaps he would regret it. But he could not leave her here, could not abandon her to the mob that would inevitably form when people realized what she had done. He owed her nothing, but he had saved her life, and that created a bond, a responsibility, whether he wanted it or not. Jacob lifted her. She did not protest and carried her away from the burning town, toward the cabin in the trees. Ash followed without being led, loyal as always. Behind them, Redemption Bend continued its transformation from place to memory, from something solid to something that would exist only in stories told around future campfires. The cabin was small and spare, a single room with a stone fireplace and a bed frame stripped of its mattress. Whoever had lived here was long gone, fled with the others, or perhaps never present at all. Jacob laid the woman on the bare floor near the fireplace, where moonlight through the single window provided enough illumination to see by. She curled onto her side immediately, shaking despite the heat that still lingered in the air from the nearby fires. He found a pump outside and worked the handle until water flowed, rust-colored at first but clearing after a moment. He soaked his bandana and brought it back inside, kneeling beside her. She flinched when he touched the cloth to her face, but then relaxed, allowing him to wipe away some of the soot and ash. Underneath, her skin was pale, almost translucent, marked with small scars around her hairline. Old scars. Deliberate ones. She watched him while he worked, those gray eyes never leaving his face. He could see her gathering strength, preparing to speak, to explain. Part of him wanted to stop her, to maintain the silence, to avoid knowing whatever truth had driven her to this, but a larger part needed to understand. Needed to know if there was any reason, any justification, that could make sense of the burning town behind them. When she finally spoke, her voice was a ruined whisper, each word clearly painful. But she pushed through it, driven by a need to confess, to be heard, to make him understand. She told him her name was Sarah Coulter. She had come to Redemption Bend 6 months prior, brought as the bride of William Reeves, who owned the silver mine that had made the town possible. She had been promised a life of comfort, of security, of freedom from the poverty that had marked her existence in Philadelphia. Reeves had courted her through letters, had seemed kind, had offered her a future she could not refuse. The reality had been different. Reeves was a tyrant who ruled the town through fear and money. He owned the mine, owned the land most of the buildings sat on, owned the store where people bought their supplies. Cross him, and you found yourself without work, without credit, without a future. He kept the workers in line through debt and intimidation. He kept his wife in line through violence. The scars on her hairline, she explained, came from the first time she tried to leave. He had dragged her back by her hair, had beaten her unconscious, had locked her in the mine storage shed for 3 days without food or water. When he finally released her, he made clear what would happen if she tried again. And he made clear that no one in town would help her. They were all too afraid, too dependent on him. For 6 months, she had endured, had played the role of dutiful wife, had smiled at his dinners, had stood at his side during town meetings, had suffered his fists in the privacy of their home. She had looked for escape, had saved what little money she could hide, had written letters to relatives back east that Reeves intercepted and burned. And then, 3 days ago, she had overheard a conversation, Reeves and 3 of his men, planning to collapse part of the mine where the workers had been agitating for better pay, planning to make it look like an accident, planning to kill 15 men who had the audacity to ask for a living wage. She had tried to warn them, had gone to the workers' camp in secret, had told them what she had heard. They had not believed her. Or perhaps they had, but were too frightened to act. Reeves's reach was long. His vengeance was certain. So she had made a different choice. She had waited until Reeves left town for a supply run to Silver Creek, had waited until most of his men went with him. And then she had gone to his office in the assayer's building and found what she needed: documents, evidence, proof that he had been shorting the workers' pay for months, pocketing the difference, proof that he had bribed the territory marshal to ignore safety violations, proof of bribes, extortion, fraud. And she had set the fire, not to destroy the town, not to kill innocents, but to destroy the evidence before Reeves returned, to burn his office, his records, everything he could use to maintain his control. She had been careful, had started the fire in the afternoon when people would have time to evacuate, had shouted warnings, had helped people escape. But the fire had spread faster than she anticipated. The kerosene she used had been too effective. The wind had picked up, and her escape route had been cut off. She had run to the stable, had hidden there, had realized too late that she had created something she could not control. The town was burning because she had underestimated the fire's hunger. The people were suffering because she had tried to save them from Reeves's planned massacre and had instead created a different catastrophe. When she finished speaking, her voice gave out entirely, reduced to a thin rasp. She lay on the cabin floor, exhausted, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. Jacob sat in silence, processing everything she had told him, trying to fit it into his understanding of right and wrong, justice and vengeance. He thought of his brother, Thomas, thought of the men who had killed him. He had tracked them for days, had planned their deaths in elaborate detail. What made him different from Sarah Coulter? She had set a fire to stop a murderer. He was hunting men to kill them for killing. Were either of them justified? Or were they both simply lost, drowning in their own pain, striking out blindly and hoping to hit something that deserved it? Outside, the night had grown quiet. The fires still burned, but distantly now, their roar reduced to a whisper. Morning would come soon, bringing with it cold clarity and consequences neither of them could avoid. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness. Her fingers were blistered and raw, but she held on tightly, desperately, as if he were the only thing preventing her from floating away into nothing. He did not pull back this time. Instead, he sat with her through the long hours before dawn, two broken people seeking warmth in the ashes of their choices. Morning brought William Reeves. Jacob heard the horses first, multiple riders moving fast from the south. He was on his feet instantly, moving to the window, peering through the grimy glass. 6 men, mounted and armed, led by a figure he recognized from Sarah's description, tall, well-dressed despite the trail dust, riding a black stallion that probably cost more than most men in Redemption Bend earned in a year, Reeves. Behind Jacob, Sarah struggled to sit up, her damaged body protesting. She saw his posture, the tension in his shoulders, and understood immediately. Fear transformed her face, the same raw terror he had seen in her eyes when he pulled her from the stable. She tried to stand, to flee, but her legs would not support her. She collapsed back to the floor with a small cry that she tried to muffle behind her hand. Jacob moved away from the window and knelt beside her. Their eyes met, and in that moment, without words, a decision was made. He could not explain it, could not justify it logically, but he knew with absolute certainty that he would not let Reeves take her. Whatever she had done, whatever consequences she deserved, they would not come from a man who beat his wife and planned to murder workers for asking for fairness. The riders stopped outside the cabin. Jacob heard boots hitting ground, spurs jingling, the creak of leather. Then a voice, cultured and smooth, the kind of voice that belonged in drawing rooms and theaters, not in this burned-out mining town. The voice called Sarah's name, told her he knew she was inside, told her to come out and face what she had done like an adult, not a child. Promised that if she came peacefully, he would be merciful. Promised that he loved her, that he understood she was confused, that they could fix this together. The lies were smooth as honey, but Jacob heard the violence underneath. He had heard men speak that way before, had learned to recognize the particular tone that preceded brutality. Reeves would kill her. If not immediately, then slowly, over years, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a shell too frightened to remember it had once been human. Jacob stood and moved to the door. He placed his hand on the rough wood, feeling the grain beneath his palm, and thought about his brother one more time. Thomas had always been the good one, the one who believed in law and order and justice. Thomas would have told him to turn Sarah over, to let the system decide her fate. Thomas would have been disappointed in what Jacob was about to do. But Thomas was dead, and the living had to make their own choices. Jacob opened the door and stepped outside. The 6 men were arrayed in a semicircle before the cabin, all mounted, all armed. Reeves sat in the center, every inch the gentleman mine owner, his face showing concern rather than anger. A mask, a performance for the men around him, in case any of them still had consciences. Reeves smiled when he saw Jacob. It was the smile of a man used to getting what he wanted, when he wanted it, without question or consequence. He tipped his hat in a mockery of courtesy. Then he spoke, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. He thanked Jacob for finding his wife, for keeping her safe during the terrible tragedy that had befallen their town. He explained that Sarah was unwell, had been unwell for some time, prone to fits and delusions. He expressed his deep gratitude for Jacob's heroism in saving her from the fire. And he asked with perfect politeness for Jacob to bring Sarah out so he could take her home, take her somewhere she could receive proper care. Every word was a lie wrapped in silk. Jacob stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the gun at his hip, and said nothing. He simply looked at Reeves, let the silence stretch, let it become uncomfortable. He watched the smile on Reeves's face grow strained, watched impatience flicker behind the mask. Reeves tried again, his voice harder now, less cultured. He reminded Jacob that Sarah was his wife, his property by law, and that interfering with a man's right to his wife was a crime in this territory. He noted that Jacob was a stranger here, with no claim, no authority, no right to involve himself in domestic affairs. He suggested, with barely veiled threat, that it would be wise for Jacob to simply step aside and let this matter be resolved by those to whom it pertained. Jacob remained silent. Behind him, he could hear Sarah's ragged breathing, could feel her watching through some crack or gap in the cabin's walls. He thought about all the times he had walked away from trouble, had told himself that other people's problems were not his concern, that survival meant minding your own business and keeping your head down. He thought about all the times that choice had haunted him later, in quiet moments, when he wondered if he had become the kind of man who stood by while evil did its work. Not today. Jacob's hand moved to his gun, not drawing it, just resting there. A statement. A line drawn in the dust and dirt and ash. The men behind Reeves stirred, hands moving to their own weapons. The morning, which had been peaceful, suddenly hummed with potential violence. Reeves's mask slipped entirely. His face transformed, revealing the ugly truth underneath rage barely contained, violence long practiced. He leaned forward in his saddle, abandoning all pretense of civility, and told Jacob exactly what would happen if he did not comply. The threats were detailed and creative. They involved pain. They involved watching Sarah suffer. They involved pieces of Jacob's body ending up in places they did not belong. Through it all, Jacob stood silent. And then, from behind him, Sarah appeared in the doorway. She was barely able to stand, using the doorframe for support, but she had dragged herself upright through sheer will. She looked at Reeves with eyes empty of fear, empty of everything except exhaustion. And she spoke, her ruined voice barely audible but carrying enough to reach the men. She told them everything. Told them about the beatings, the imprisonment, the planned mine collapse. Told them about the evidence she had burned, the documents that proved Reeves's theft and corruption. Told them that she had set the fire, yes, but only to destroy his office, only to rob him of the power he held over them all. Told them she was sorry for the damage, sorry for the town, sorry for everything, except refusing to be his victim anymore. The men behind Reeves shifted uncomfortably. Jacob watched their faces, saw doubt creep in, saw them looking at their boss with new eyes. These were not hired killers. They were miners, workers, men who knew what it meant to be under Reeves's thumb. Sarah's words found purchase in them, planted seeds of question, of rebellion. Reeves saw it too, saw his control slipping. And like all tyrants when their power is threatened, he reached for violence. He went for his gun. Time contracted, each second stretching into something elastic and strange. Jacob's hand was already moving, muscle memory taking over, the countless hours of practice distilling into pure instinct. His revolver cleared leather as Reeves's weapon rose. 2 guns, 2 men, 2 futures colliding in the space between heartbeats. Jacob fired first. The shot caught Reeves in the shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. His own gun discharged into the air, the bullet disappearing into the morning sky. The black stallion reared, startled by the gunfire, and Reeves fell, hitting the ground hard, his weapon tumbling from his grip. The other 5 men reached for their guns, hands moving with varying degrees of speed and commitment. Jacob's revolver was already tracking toward them, but he held fire, watching, waiting to see who would commit, who would actually draw. These men were followers, not leaders. With Reeves down, their certainty evaporated. One man older than the others, face weathered by decades of mine work, raised his hands slowly, deliberately, and backed his horse away from the confrontation. A second followed his lead, then a third. The remaining 2 held their positions, guns half drawn, torn between loyalty and self-preservation. Reeves was screaming from the ground, ordering them to shoot, to kill Jacob, to bring him Sarah, but his voice had lost its power. He was no longer the mine owner in his fine suit, commanding respect and fear. He was just a man bleeding in the dirt, clutching his shoulder, his authority leaking out with his blood. The 2 remaining men looked at each other, some silent communication passing between them. Then they holstered their weapons and turned their horses, following the others away from the cabin, away from Reeves, away from a loyalty that had never been freely given. Jacob watched them go, his gun still raised, until they disappeared around a bend in the path. Only then did he lower the weapon and turn his attention to Reeves, who was struggling to sit up, his face twisted with pain and impotent rage. Sarah moved past Jacob, somehow finding strength she should not have possessed. She walked toward her husband, each step costing her, until she stood above him. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, this man who had promised her the world and delivered only suffering. Jacob expected her to say something, to deliver some final judgment, some cutting words that would make sense of all the pain. Instead, she turned away and walked back toward the cabin, leaving Reeves bleeding and alone in the morning sun. Jacob followed her inside. She collapsed the moment she crossed the threshold, all remaining strength spent. He caught her before she hit the floor, lowered her gently, cradled her head in his lap. Her eyes were closing, body shutting down from exhaustion and trauma and smoke damage. She needed a doctor, needed medicine, needed care he could not provide. But the nearest doctor was in Silver Creek, a full day's ride. And with Reeves's men scattered and the town destroyed, there was no help coming from Redemption Bend. Jacob would have to take her himself, would have to hope she survived the journey. He carried her outside where Ash waited patiently. Reeves was gone, dragging himself away, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. Jacob did not look for him. Whatever happened to Reeves now was between the man and the universe's sense of justice. Jacob had his own concerns. He settled Sarah on Ash's back, climbing up behind her, holding her securely against his chest. She was barely conscious, head lolling, but her hand found his shirt again, gripping weakly. That small gesture, trust despite everything, connection despite circumstances, threatened to break something in him that had remained intact through years of violence and loss. They rode south as the sun climbed higher, leaving behind the smoking ruins of Redemption Bend. Jacob looked back once, saw the skeletal remains of buildings pointing accusatory fingers at the sky, saw smoke still rising from ember-filled wreckage. A town built on silver, destroyed by fire, mourned by no one who mattered. As they rode, Jacob thought about justice and revenge, about the difference between the two and whether that difference actually existed. He thought about his brother, about the men he had been tracking, about the trail he had abandoned. He thought about Sarah Coulter, this woman who had tried to fight a monster and had created destruction she never intended. He thought about himself, about the man he was and the man he might become, and whether those two versions could ever reconcile. By noon, Sarah's fever had grown worse. She was burning up, shivering despite the sun's heat. Jacob urged Ash faster, pushing the mare harder than he should have, asking her for speed she might not have to give. The loyal horse responded, lengthening her stride, carrying her doubled burden towards Silver Creek and whatever salvation might wait there. They reached the town as evening shadows began to stretch across the land. Silver Creek was larger than Redemption Bend, built on cattle money as well as mining, with actual laws and lawmen to enforce them. Jacob rode straight to the doctor's office, a small building marked with a faded sign, and pounded on the door until an older man with spectacles answered, irritation on his face that transformed to concern when he saw Sarah's condition. The Dr. Warren was his name. Helped Jacob carry Sarah inside and lay her on an examination table. He shooed Jacob out of the room, closed the door, left him to pace the waiting area while medicine happened behind that barrier. Jacob sat on a hard wooden bench, elbows on knees, head in hands, and waited for news that might break him or save him, though he was not sure which he feared more. Hours passed. Darkness fell. A lawman appeared, the town marshal, drawn by reports of a stranger carrying an unconscious woman. Jacob told him the truth, or most of it. Told him about Reeves, about the beatings, about the fire. Left out Sarah's confession, left out her role. Made it sound like she was victim only, never perpetrator. The marshal listened with a skeptical expression, but did not challenge the story. He said he would send men to Redemption Bend to investigate, to see what remained, to take statements from survivors. Jacob thanked him and returned to his vigil. Near midnight, Dr. Warren emerged from the examination room. His expression was unreadable, carefully neutral. Jacob stood, heart hammering, waiting for the pronouncement. The doctor removed his spectacles, cleaned them on his shirt, replaced them. A delaying tactic, Jacob realized. A way to prepare for difficult news. Warren told him that Sarah would live. Her lungs were damaged but would heal. Her body was battered but not broken. She was young, strong despite appearances. With rest and proper care, she would recover. But in here the doctor paused, choosing his words carefully. She would never be the same. The smoke damage was permanent. Her voice might improve but would never fully return. She would have scars, inside and out, that no medicine could erase. Jacob absorbed this, feeling relief and grief in equal measure. She would live. That was what mattered. Everything else could be dealt with later. Warren studied him for a long moment, then asked the question Jacob had been dreading. Asked who would be responsible for her care, for her recovery, for her future. She had no family in Silver Creek, no connections, no resources. The doctor could keep her for a few days, but beyond that, she would need somewhere to go, someone to care for her. Jacob looked toward the closed door, toward the room where Sarah lay unconscious and healing. He thought about the men he had been hunting, the revenge he had been pursuing. He thought about the trail gone cold, the justice unserved. He thought about riding away, returning to his hunt, leaving Sarah to the care of strangers and the mercy of a world that had shown her precious little mercy thus far. He thought about all of it. And then he told the doctor he would take responsibility, would ensure she had what she needed, would see her through recovery and whatever came after. The words surprised him as he spoke them, but once said, they felt right. Felt inevitable, as if he had been moving toward this decision since the moment he pulled her from those flames. Warren nodded, satisfied, and returned to his work. Jacob settled back onto the bench, preparing for a long night. Outside, Silver Creek slept peacefully, unaware of the small drama playing out in the doctor's office, unaware that two broken people had found each other in fire and ash, and were now bound by something neither fully understood. 3 weeks later, they left Silver Creek together. Sarah had recovered enough to travel, though her voice remained damaged and Dr. Warren predicted it always would. She spoke rarely, and when she did, it was in soft whispers that carried only to those close enough to lean in and listen. Jacob had grown accustomed to reading her expressions instead, the subtle language of her eyes and hands that communicated more than words ever could. During those 3 weeks, the marshal had returned from Redemption Bend with news. The town was indeed destroyed, but most of the residents had survived. They had scattered to surrounding settlements, some heading east to start over, others moving to Silver Creek itself. The marshal had found Reeves 2 days after the shooting, bleeding out in a ravine 3 miles from town. The man had survived his shoulder wound, but had fallen from his horse in a fever delirium and broken his neck in the tumble. The territory had ruled it an accident, a tragic end to a man who had lost everything in the fire. No one mourned him. The marshal reported this flatly, without judgment, but Jacob saw the satisfaction in his eyes. Some men earned their deaths. The workers from Reeves's mine had come forward with their own stories during the investigation. Stories of abuse, of theft, of the planned collapse that Sarah had overheard. The documents she had burned could not be recovered, but testimony from a dozen men painted a clear enough picture. The marshal had listened, had taken notes, and had ultimately filed a report that said the fire in Redemption Bend started in the assayer's office due to an overturned lantern during an altercation. No charges would be filed. No one would be held accountable. Sarah had wept when Jacob told her this news. Not from relief, but from grief for all the people displaced, all the lives disrupted by her desperate act. Jacob had held her while she cried, had offered no platitudes or false comfort. Some guilt could not be absolved, only carried. He knew this from personal experience. Now they rode north together, Ash carrying both of them with patient endurance. Jacob had decided to abandon his hunt for his brother's killers. The trail was cold, and the rage that had driven him had transformed into something else, something less consuming. Thomas would have wanted him to live, not to destroy himself pursuing vengeance that would bring no one back. It was time to find a different path. Sarah rode in front of him, her back against his chest, silent and watchful. She had not asked where they were going, had simply trusted him when he said he knew a place. A ranch owned by a friend from his army days, a man named Coleman who ran cattle in Montana Territory and was always looking for help. Jacob had sent a wire ahead, had received a terse reply in return. Come, work waiting, no questions asked. That was Coleman. A man who understood that everyone had a past, and that sometimes the past was best left unexamined. They traveled through country that grew progressively greener and cooler as they moved north. The harsh desert landscape gave way to grasslands, then to rolling hills dotted with pine. Streams ran clear and cold, and at night the stars seemed close enough to touch. They camped under those stars, Jacob building small fires while Sarah prepared their simple meals. A routine developed, comfortable in its silence, profound in its unspoken trust. One evening, a week into their journey, Sarah touched his arm to get his attention. When he looked at her, she used her hands to ask a question. Why had he not turned her in? Why had he protected her when she was guilty, when she deserved punishment? Jacob considered his answer carefully. He had asked himself the same question many times during the long nights in Silver Creek, watching over her while she healed. The truth was complicated, layered with his own guilt and grief and complicated morality. But he tried to distill it into something she could understand. He told her that guilt and innocence were rarely absolute, that she had made a choice under impossible circumstances, had tried to stop a greater evil and had misjudged the consequences. That yes, people had suffered because of her actions, but they would have suffered, would have died, if she had done nothing. That sometimes there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. He told her about Thomas, about the men he had been hunting, about the revenge he had been planning. Told her that he understood the desire to make monsters pay, to strike back against the things that hurt you. Told her that he had been ready to kill in cold blood, to become exactly what he hated, and that finding her in that fire had saved him from that transformation. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face. When he finished, she took his hand and held it between both of hers, pressed it against her heart. No words were necessary. They understood each other in the way that only broken things can understand one another, seeing the cracks, the repairs, the imperfect healing, and recognizing it as beautiful because it meant survival. They reached Coleman's ranch on a crisp autumn afternoon. The place was sprawling and rough, hundreds of acres of grazing land hemmed by mountains on 3 sides. The main house was solid timber, built to withstand Montana winters. Outbuildings dotted the landscape, bunkhouses, barns, corrals. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, dots of brown and white against the green. Coleman himself came out to meet them, a bear of a man with a thick beard and eyes that had seen too much but still managed to find humor in the world. He greeted Jacob with a crushing embrace, then turned to Sarah with gentleness that seemed incongruous with his size. He asked no questions about who she was or where she had come from. He simply welcomed her, showed them to a small cabin at the edge of the property, and told Jacob to report for work in the morning. That night, in the cabin that would be their home, Sarah and Jacob sat across from each other at a rough wooden table. A single candle burned between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Sarah reached across the table and took Jacob's hand. She looked at him with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he forced himself to hold her gaze. She was trying to communicate something important, something that transcended her damaged voice. With her free hand, she traced letters on the tabletop. Slowly, deliberately, spelling out a question that changed everything. Can we be new people here? Jacob looked at those traced letters, at the hope in her eyes, at the possibility hanging between them like something fragile and precious. He thought about all the things they had done, all the ways they had failed and survived and stumbled forward. He thought about whether people could truly change, or if they were forever defined by their worst moments. He did not know the answer, but he realized that not knowing was itself a kind of freedom. They could try. They could wake each morning and choose to be better than they had been. They could carry their guilt without letting it destroy them. They could build something new from the ashes of who they had been. Jacob squeezed her hand and nodded. Yes, they could try to be new people. Together. Sarah smiled then, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face entirely. Made her look young again, unburdened, alive with possibility. In that moment, Jacob felt something in his chest unlock, some tight knot of grief and rage finally releasing its hold. They had both been pulled from flames literal and metaphorical. They had both confessed their sins and found not judgment, but understanding. They were both broken, both guilty, both trying to figure out how to live with what they had done. But they were alive, and they were not alone. That would have to be enough. 6 months passed. Winter came to Montana with teeth and fury, burying the ranch under snow that reached the eaves of the buildings. Jacob and Sarah weathered it together in their small cabin, feeding the fire, caring for the animals, finding warmth in proximity and shared silence. Jacob worked Coleman's cattle when the weather allowed, riding fence lines and checking on livestock, earning his keep and then some. Sarah helped with the ranch's accounts, her neat handwriting and careful calculations proving invaluable to Coleman's disorganized records. They were not lovers, but something deeper. Partners. Two people who had seen each other at their worst and had chosen to stay anyway. They shared the cabin, the work, the quiet evenings. They built a life from ordinary moments, morning coffee, evening meals, the comfortable silence of two people who did not need words to communicate. Spring brought a visitor. Jacob was mending fence near the northern pasture when he saw the rider approaching. His hand moved instinctively to his gun, old habits dying hard, but he forced himself to relax when he recognized the horse. It was one of the marshal's deputies from Silver Creek, a young man named Hayes who had helped with the Redemption Bend investigation. Hayes dismounted and approached with visible nervousness. He carried a letter, dusty and travel-worn, and held it out to Jacob like it might bite. Jacob took it, noting the official seal, the careful script. He opened it while Hayes watched, read the contents twice to make sure he understood. The letter was from the territory governor's office. It stated that after thorough investigation into the events at Redemption Bend, no criminal charges would be filed against anyone in relation to the fire. The letter went on to commend Jacob for his heroism in saving lives during the disaster, and to note that several of William Reeves's former employees had come forward with testimony that had led to the posthumous discovery of extensive criminal activity by the deceased mine owner. At the bottom, in a different hand, someone had written a personal note, "Some fires cleanse. Let this one stay buried." Jacob folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. He thanked Hayes, who nodded and remounted, clearly relieved to have delivered his message and eager to return to Silver Creek before the mountain passes became impassable again. Jacob stood alone in the pasture, watching the deputy ride away, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not fully realized he had been carrying. It was over. Truly over. Sarah was safe. They both were. He returned to the cabin as evening fell, found Sarah preparing their dinner over the fire. She looked up when he entered, read something in his face, and set down her knife. He crossed to her, pulled the letter from his pocket, and handed it to her without explanation. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she parsed the official language. When she finished, she looked up at him with eyes full of questions and hope and disbelief. He nodded, confirming what the letter said. They were free, no charges, no consequences. Whatever justice the universe demanded had been exacted in other ways. Sarah's face crumpled, and she pressed the letter to her chest, shoulders shaking with sobs that made no sound. Jacob held her, let her cry, let her release the fear and guilt she had been carrying. Outside, the sun set over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of orange and red that looked for just a moment like fire. But it was not fire. It was just light, just the sun doing what it always did, turning the world beautiful before surrendering it to darkness. That night, they sat outside the cabin despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars emerge one by one. Sarah's hand found his beneath the blanket, fingers interlacing. They sat like that for hours, saying nothing, needing nothing, simply existing together in the quiet peace they had built from ruins. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. A coyote sang to the moon. The wind moved through the pines with that breathing sound Jacob had come to love. It was not the life either of them had imagined, was not the future they would have chosen, but it was theirs. Honest and imperfect and earned through fire and confession, and the difficult choice to forgive themselves and each other. Jacob thought about Redemption Bend one last time. Thought about the town that had burned, about the people displaced, about William Reeves dying alone in a ravine. He thought about his brother Thomas, about the revenge he had abandoned, about the man he might have become if he had not pulled Sarah from those flames. Some things were destroyed by fire, but some things were forged in it, made stronger through the heat, transformed into something better than what they had been. He looked at Sarah, at her profile etched against the starlight, and knew that he had been given something precious. Not redemption, that was too clean, too complete, but a chance. An opportunity to be better than his worst moment, to build something good from the wreckage of his mistakes. She turned to him, and even in the darkness, he could see her smile. That small expression that said more than words ever could. That said, "We survived. We are enough." Yes, Jacob thought. We are. Behind them, the cabin glowed with lamplight. Ahead, the future stretched unknown and uncertain. But in this moment, they had everything that mattered. They had survived the flames. They had confessed their sins. And they had chosen, against all logic and expectation, to trust each other with the broken pieces of who they were. That trust was the most courageous thing either of them had ever done. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent. The world continued its rotation, carrying them forward into tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. And somewhere in the ashes of Redemption Bend, where no one would ever build again, new grass would soon push through the charred soil, life returning. The slow, stubborn persistence of hope. Jacob squeezed Sarah's hand, and she squeezed back. They would be all right. Not perfect, not unburdened, but all right. And that was more than either of them had dared to hope for when he pulled her from those flames, and she confessed the truth that broke him, and, In breaking him, remade him into someone capable of forgiveness, of mercy, of love earned through fire and ash, and the hard work of becoming new. The story could have ended 100 different ways, but it ended like this, with two people who had destroyed and been destroyed, finding in each other something worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth the difficult daily choice to be gentle with one another's scars. The flames had taken everything, but from the ashes, they had built something worth keeping.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.